Officer Morgan wasn't alarmed by the first bark. The second made him hesitate. But the third it carried something different. A low, guttural urgency that raised the hairs on the back of his neck like a silent warning. Ranger, his canine partner, wasn't the type to bark without reason. He wasn't a house pet chasing squirrels. His behavior was trained, focused, and deliberate, especially now. In the middle of nowhere, Morgan turned on his heel, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots as he looked down the narrow, overgrown trail they'd been following for the past hour. Shafts of light pierced through the autumn foliage, the scent of pine and decaying leaves riding on the brisk Missouri air. This path wasn't on any current maps. It had once been used by wildlife, long before a housing development project stalled and nature began reclaiming the land, but Ranger wasn't paying any attention to the trail. He stood rigid beside an old stone well, refusing to move. "Easy, buddy," Morgan said, stepping closer. Ranger's ears twitched at his voice, but his eyes stayed locked on the well. A low whine escaped his throat as he sniffed at the moss-covered stones. The leash pulled tight in Morgan's grip. The well looked ancient, hand-laid stone covered in lichen. The wooden beam above it had rotted completely through, and the rusted chain dangled like some forgotten relic. "All right," Morgan muttered to himself. "Let's see what's got you spooked." He unclipped a flashlight from his vest and leaned over the edge. The beam disappeared into a deep shaft of darkness, swallowing the light hole. No echo, no sound. Just cold, damp air wafting up from the bottom. "Probably just a dead animal," he said, though even he didn't believe it. Ranger still didn't move. This was supposed to be a routine sweep, a quiet patrol around the outskirts of Coldwater. Nothing major. A new recruit was starting soon, and Morgan had volunteered to give Ranger a workout before the upcoming canine demonstrations. But now, something didn't feel right. His instincts, honed over years on the force, told him to pay attention. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small inspection camera, the kind used in tight spaces. He attached it to the old bucket chain and lowered it slowly, watching the tiny monitor. At first, it showed only stone, then damp soil. Then, suddenly, a flicker. He froze the cable. Something had moved, a brief flash of motion, a shadow, a glimmer of light that didn't belong. He leaned in, eyes fixed on the screen. Then he heard it, faint, almost lost in the static. 3 distinct taps. Then silence. Back at his cruiser, Morgan called it in. Nothing urgent, just abnormal animal behavior and a possible underground disturbance. Standard protocol. Dispatch said they'd send a team out later that afternoon. Nan-emergency. Morgan leaned back, eyes drifting to the tree line. Something about those knocks lingered in his mind. He didn't believe in ghost seed, seen too much real horror in the desert to fear myths, but he trusted instincts. And Ranger's tail wasn't wagging. It stood stiff, his body alert, the same posture he had when things were about to go bad. The next hour was spent sweeping the area. Ranger wouldn't leave the well. He kept circling the same patch of earth, barking again and again. Morgan marked the GPS coordinates, snapped a few pictures, and completed a basic incident report. It should have been nothing, just another strange call involving a dog and an old well. But as he climbed back into his vehicle, a thought hit him like a brick. What if someone's down there? By 3:45 p.m., the excavation team had arrived. The sun was slipping behind the hills, casting long shadows through the woods. Morgan briefed them quickly. They brought ground sonar and thermal equipment. The well was estimated to be about 60 feet deep, partially collapsed in places, but still stable. The probe went down 15 feet, 30, then 42. Static filled the feed. Then, a sudden spike, a heat signature, weak, ... But human ... The entire crew fell silent. One of the rescuers muttered under his breath. Another asked the question that had been echoing in Morgan's head all day. Could someone still be alive down there? He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ranger barked short, sharp, and loud. That evening, Morgan sat at his desk reviewing reports when a rookie officer dropped a file onto his desk. Lucas Trent, the rookie said. Disappeared 9 years ago. Investigative journalist, cold case. Morgan stared at the faded photograph. Clean-cut glasses, mid-30s, a man known for asking questions in a town that preferred silence. He'd filed his last report on illegal land development just 2 miles from the well, then vanished. Morgan didn't sleep that night. He played the tapping sound again and again on his phone, listening closely, counting the rhythm. Could it be Morse code? 3 short taps, then silence. He picked up a pen and jotted down 3 letters, SOS. The next morning, the rescue crew returned. They brought ropes, harnesses, and a technician slim enough to fit into the shaft. Morgan stayed above with Ranger, who paced in circles, ears standing tall. 30 minutes passed. Then a voice echoed from the darkness. I see something. A pause. Holy, I think he's alive. When they pulled him out, everyone gasped. He was covered in mud, skin pale and sunken, barely conscious, his clothes reduced to tatters. Clutched tightly to his chest was a photograph, crumpled and damp but still readable. A woman and a little girl. On the back, Maggie and Ella, 2015. Lucas Trent hadn't vanished. He'd been buried alive. Later. In the warmth of a softly lit hospital room, Officer Morgan watched over him. The chill that had crawled under his skin all day still hadn't left. Trent looked more like a ghost than a man. The man lying in that hospital bed looked like a shadow of someone who used to be whole. His cheeks were sunken, lips cracked, and his wide haunted eyes hinted at years without sunlight. Every sudden movement made him flinch. Even at rest, his fists remained clenched at his sides. Officer Morgan stood silently at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, with Ranger sitting alert beside him. How long? Lucas's voice came out dry and brittle, barely more than a whisper, rusted from years of disuse. Morgan stepped forward. You've been gone 9 years, Mr. Trent. Lucas blinked slowly, his mind catching up. 9 years. A nurse entered quietly, adjusted the Ford drip, and gave a small, reassuring smile. But Morgan saw the truth in her eyes. She was rattled. Who wouldn't be? Nobody expected a man to survive that long, especially not at the bottom of a well in rural Missouri, with nothing but darkness to keep him company. Once the nurse stepped out, Morgan dragged a folding chair close to the bed and sat down. Do you remember where you were? Lucas gave a faint nod. In the dark. In that well. The whole time. Morgan didn't press for more. The doctors had made it clear Lucas needed time, fluids, rest. But whispers were already circling through the department. Coldwater hadn't seen anything like this since the old mill explosion back in '98. Someone had deliberately buried a man alive and nearly got away with it. But why and who? Lucas Trent wasn't just another name on a missing persons list. He was an investigative journalist with the St. Louis Daily Observer. And back in 2015, he'd been chasing a lead on shady land deals in Coldwater. Secret votes, bribery, and forced property sales. He was uncovering the kind of corruption that makes enemies. Morgan pulled the old case file again. The last person Lucas had been scheduled to meet before vanishing was Franklin Ellis, a former zoning board member. Oddly enough, Ellis had disappeared 2 years ago under equally strange circumstances. It was too clean. Too well timed. Leaning back in his desk chair, Morgan let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. What the hell did you uncover, Lucas? The next morning, Morgan returned to the woods with Ranger. They followed the same trail to the well, this time joined by 2 detectives, a forensic tech, an Officer Dania local who knew the backcountry like family recipes. She was the one who spotted something odd, a pattern in the brush about 40 feet west of the well. Someone camped here, she said, crouching. Not recently though. See the old ash and flattened ground. They stayed a while, then left fast. Ranger sniffed around, circling until he froze near a patch of disturbed soil. He scratched twice, then barked once. Morgan knelt beside him and unearthed a small rusted metal box. Inside were a cracked press badge, a damaged voice recorder, and several rolls of undeveloped film. The badge read, Lucas Trent, Observer, back. At the station, the film was rushed to the lab, and the recorder was sent for recovery. When the technician finally played a usable audio clip, the room fell silent. The sound quality was rough, warped by time, but the voice was unmistakably Lucas, whispering with urgency. This is Trent. September 3, 2015. I'm on my way to meet Franklin. He told me everything about the land deals, the payments. If something happens, look at parcel number 47B and check Ellis's church files. There's more to this than zoning fraud. It's bigger, much bigger. The message ended in static. Parcel 47B. Morgan called Danny, who was off duty. She answered immediately. That's Ridgeview Baptist Camp. It was sold in 2013 to some holding company. No one's touched it in years. You think it's connected? Think we need to check it out, Morgan said. They set out the next morning before sunrise. Ranger rode quietly in the back seat, ears perked. Ridgeview was 15 miles out of town, beyond abandoned logging roads, fenced off and long forgotten. Danny unlocked the rusted gate, its hinges groaning like something out of a horror movie. The place was unsettling in the morning, mice empty cabins, a collapsed mess hall, and a decaying chapel, but it was what lay beneath the chapel that froze. Morgan in his tracks, a hidden cellar not locked, just concealed. Ranger growled low as they approached. Morgan flicked on his flashlight and descended the narrow steps. The air was thick with mold and dampness. Then something else, bleach. The beam moved slowly across the walls, chains bolted to the floor, a stained mattress, torn blankets, a rusted plate. Dear God, Danny murmured behind him. Under a loose floorboard, they found a leather folder. Inside, surveillance photos of Lucas, of Franklin, even of Morgan's precinct, names, payment records, and detailed notes on how to ensure silence and compliance. This wasn't just corruption, it was systematic, organized. Back at the hospital, Morgan visited Lucas again. After the nurses left, he placed a photograph of parcel 47B on the table beside the bed. Lucas stared at it, eyes going wide. I told them I'd go public, he said softly. I had enough to bring charges. You met with Franklin? Morgan asked. Lucas nodded. He was afraid too, said he'd testify, but the next day he vanished. You think they killed him? Lucas shook his head slowly. No, I think. He knew too much, same as me. I think they hid him somewhere. Somewhere worse. Morgan's heart thudded in his chest. Worse. There are more sites, Lucas said, his voice trembling. I heard them talking. 3 wells. 3 silos. 1 assigned to each of them. That night, Morgan pored over the county's survey maps, comparing them against coordinates hastily jotted down in Lucas's recovered notes. Ranger, ever watchful, lay nearby, tracking his handler's every move. At last, the pieces fell into place. 3 remote, long-forgotten locations. 1 had already been uncovered. 2 remained untouched, and someone clearly wanted them to stay that way. Sleep didn't come to the cold water precinct that night, not after what Morgan uncovered beneath the old chapel. The folder had been handed off to the state, its contents unsettling, blurry. Hastily taken photos showed Lucas, Trent, Franklin Ellis, and 3 unidentified men. They were time-stamped and marked with scribbled captions. Pages inside detailed off-the-books, financial transfers, names circled in red ink, and cryptic notes that sounded more like threats than ledger entries. Obeyed. Needs reminding, will fold. Morgan had seen his fair share over the years to military deployments and 6 years in homicide, but this was different. This was decay, not just hidden but deeply embedded. The kind that poisons everything it touches. By 6 a.m., he was back at his desk, Ranger stretched out. Beside him, ears twitching at passing footsteps. A desk lamp illuminated a worn zoning map. 3 pins marked the spots. One was where Lucas had been found. Another Ridgeview Baptist Camp matched parcel for 7B. But the third, Morgan's gaze locked on a red X scrawled in one corner. The handwriting didn't belong to Lucas. It matched the script from the black folder tight, all caps, full of restrained fury. He traced the mark with a finger. Dry Creek Grain Silo. Long abandoned. Located nearly 30 miles south of Coldwater. Constructed in the 1970s, the facility had shut down in the early 2000s when crop subsidies dried up. It had been slated for demolition 5 years ago, but the red tape never cleared. Morgan called it in himself. No backup, not yet. He needed to see it for himself first. He loaded Ranger into the cruiser, checked his gear, and set off. The sun was just beginning to rise. The morning air felt unnaturally still. Dry Creek wasn't a town anymore. A name left behind, with 3 rusted mailboxes and a collapsing church steeple to show for it. The silo towered over a cracked access road, surrounded by waist-high weeds and a fence held together by rust and luck. Morgan parked near the gate, opened the trunk, and clipped Ranger's leash to his vest. The dog was instantly alert, posture rigid, tail straight. They approached slowly, gravel crunching beneath their boots. A faded warning sign fluttered weakly in the breeze, condemned. "Do not enter," Morgan muttered to himself. Not exactly a day for following orders. Inside, the air was stale thick with dust, mildew, and old machinery. Discarded grain husks littered the floor like remnants of a harvest long past. Ranger moved ahead, nose low, pace increasing. They rounded a collapsed conveyor belt near the far wall. That's when Morgan spotted a trapdoor, made of newer wood. Its paint lightly scratched, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. His stomach tightened. He reached for the radio. Unit 14 requesting immediate response to Dry Creek. Silo, possible second victim. Location appears active. Repeat, this site is not cold. Copy that, 14, came the reply. ETA for backup, 27 minutes. That was too long. Morgan unlatched the trapdoor. The odor hit immediately: rot, sweat, mold, and a hint of bleach. Like someone had tried to clean up, but barely made a dent. A metal ladder disappeared into darkness. Ranger whined, pacing at the edge. Morgan clipped a flashlight to his vest and descended. Below was a narrow chamber with dirt flooring and concrete walls. On one side, a chain was looped around a pipe. The room seemed empty until Morgan spotted a figure curled in the far corner. Pale, gaunt, breathing. He rushed over. The man was unconscious, maybe drugged. A tangled beard, unkempt hair, a scar along his jaw. A heavy chain secured his ankle to the wall. Morgan keyed his radio again, confirmed male victim located, alive, identity unknown, need medics, ASAP. He leaned in closer. The man stirred and mumbled hoarsely, "Is it, Tuesday, Morgan?" Swallowed. "What's your name?" The man blinked slowly, lips cracked. "Franklin." By the time help arrived, Morgan had freed the chain and carried Franklin Ellis out himself. Ranger stayed close, never straying from his side. Paramedics loaded Franklin into the ambulance while Morgan stood silently, watching the sun rise over the wheat fields. The silence pressed in around him to victims now Lucas and Franklin, both hidden away, both discarded like waste. But now, they were speaking again, and someone wasn't happy about it. Back at the station, Lucas was strong enough to sit up. Morgan handed him a cup of coffee and took a seat beside him. "We found him," Morgan said. Lucas turned, eyes wide. "Franklin, yeah, alive, barely, just like you." Lucas exhaled sharply, as though releasing years of tension. His hand trembled as he held the cup. "They said, they said he broke. Told them everything he might have." Morgan replied carefully. Lucas's expression darkened. "Then we're both dead men." Later that night, Morgan sat in his apartment, eyes unfocused on the television screen. Ranger lay curled nearby, ears occasionally twitching. His laptop glowed on the coffee table. An old zoning archive from 2014 was open parcel for 9C. The final red X. It wasn't a well, or a church, it was a storage unit. A private facility just outside of town. Still listed under a shell company. Still sealed, Morgan picked up his phone and called Officer Daney. You up for one more? Always, she answered without pause. The following morning, the two officers arrived at the site. Tucked behind a rundown tire shop, it was surrounded by rusting units and topped with barbed wire. The gate wasn't even locked. Too easy. Morgan's gut twisted. They moved carefully toward Unit 1 to be the padlock was intact, but the metal around it was scratched. Ranger froze at the door, then growled, lower deep. Primal sound, born of instinct and warning. Morgan met Danny's eyes. She gave a sharp nod. Let's open it. The padlock gave way with a muted snap, yet the sound echoed in the still morning air like a thunderclap. Officer Morgan slipped it into his jacket pocket, pausing for a moment. Next to him, Officer Danny kept a firm hand on her weapon, eyes fixed on the rusted door of Unit 1B, as if expecting it to bite. Behind them, Ranger let out another low growler, deep, primal sound. It wasn't meant to alert, it was a signal, a warning. You ready? Morgan asked. Danny gave a quick nod. Let's go. Morgan gripped the handle, braced a foot against the base, and pulled hard. The door jerked upward with a metallic groan, rolling open to reveal a darkness that felt to still like something ancient and starved had been lying in wait. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned storage unit. Cobwebs, old dust, broken remnants of forgotten things. But Ranger moved quickly, nose working overtime. He darted toward the back corner, stopping at a large tarp covering something square and tall. Morgan followed, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He pulled the tarp back and froze. It was a chair, not a normal one. This was bolted to a steel plate in the ground, enclosed by padded walls, and outfitted with worn leather restraints, straight out of an institution. At its base, an old handheld recorder rested upright, as if someone had placed it there deliberately, and never returned. Morgan crouched and pressed play. Static crackled for a second. Then a voice, shaky and broken, filled the air. My name is Gary Phelps. If anyone finds this, I didn't run. I didn't vanish. I was taken. I don't know where I am anymore. Time doesn't make sense down here. But they keep talking about obedience, about punishment. I think I knew too much. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's my fault. The recording dissolved into static. Danny stepped back, her expression pale. Gary Phelps. He was a city contractor, right? Disappeared. In 2008, Morgan nodded as he stood up. That makes three. 3 men, 3 professions. All vanished. All hidden away. They documented everything: photographs, evidence bags, samples from the restraints, even the recorder. No one said much. There wasn't anything left to say. This wasn't about eliminating threats anymore. This was about storage. Containment. Back at the precinct, Chief Hendricks stood over the evidence laid out before him, a shadow in his eyes. You think this reaches higher? He asked quietly. Morgan didn't answer at first. He recalled what Lucas Trent had said, that the well wasn't the only one, that others were still buried, waiting to be found. This wasn't random. It was a coordinated effort. By who? Hendricks pressed. Morgan met his gaze. That's what I'm going to find out. The investigation accelerated. Warrants were filed within hours. Franklin Ellis, still recovering in the hospital, confirmed details that matched the case. Discrepancies, clandestine meetings, and one name that surfaced over and over: Earl Bowman. Former mayor of Coldwater. Retired 3 years prior. Publicly, Bowman had a spotless record. Vietnam veteran, active in the local church, a fixture at community events. But his fingerprints were everywhere: land deals involving parcel for 7B, the Ridgeview camp, and even the Dry Creek silo. The problem? Bowman had never been arrested. No charges, not even a whisper of misconduct, untouchable. But Morgan had an edge that afternoon. He brought Ranger to a small charity event where Bowman was scheduled to appear. Just a routine ribbon cutting at a local playground funded by the Bowman Foundation. Children played while Bowman shook hands and posed for photos. Dressed in his navy blazer and flag pin, Morgan strolled past once, casual, Ranger clothes at his heel, On the second pass, it happened. Ranger lunged. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just fixed his gaze on Bowman and surged forward, posture rigid, nose lifted. A clear signal, alert, target detected. Bowman's grin faltered. Morgan gave a small nod. He'd seen that reaction before. Ranger had picked up something. Something serious. An hour later, Morgan filed a formal request to examine the tax filings of Bowman's non-profit. Thanks to Danny's cousin in city records, they found exactly what they needed: a paper trail. A deed transfer buried under a shell corporation. It gave Bowman's foundation full control over a decommissioned water treatment facility 3 miles outside of town. Same funding patterns. Same suspicious silence. The very next day, they moved in. A joint operation, local SWAT, county deputies, and a federal observer from the Department of Justice. Morgan rode up front with Ranger in the lead vehicle. His heart pounded. This wasn't about theories anymore. It was real. The facility looked long forgotten: perimeter fencing, cracked concrete, peeling signage, but the locks were brand new. Cameras were tucked into the floodlights and the doors reinforced steel at precisely 4:07 a.m. They breached. Teams swept through room after room: dusty offices, rotting file cabinets, old labs. Then they found the basement. And the rooms. 6 of them, no bigger than janitor closets. Each room had a heavy, reinforced door. Inside, 5 men were discovered, frail, malnourished, but still breathing. One wore a postal uniform, stained and tattered. Another had once been a screecher. A third was a man who had been legally declared deceased back in 2011. The 6th room was different. It was empty, except for a single chair secured to the floor. Carved into the back wall were the words, "Silence is safety." That night, Bowman was taken into custody. He didn't resist. He stood there as Morgan placed the cuffs on him, expression blank, eyes forward, under the glare of local news cameras. He didn't speak or react. Just that faint, unsettling smile, as if he had expected this moment all along. Maybe even welcomed it. At the station, Morgan watched as the survivors were placed into ambulances. Lucas and Franklin stood nearby, speechless, overwhelmed. "They'll need time," Morgan said softly. "Yeah," Franklin replied. "But at least they've got it now." Ranger sat beside them, tail moving gently, taking it all in. Another case closed. Someone said. As sunlight crept over the courthouse roofline, Morgan faced the growing pile of paperwork on his desk. 6 men rescued, 3 found dead. One man behind it all, and a loyal dog who never gave up until the truth came to light. Bowman still hadn't spoken. Not during booking. Not while being fingerprinted. He remained silent when asked about other possible victims, or whether more were out there. In the interrogation room at Coldwater PD, he sat still, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on some invisible spot in the corner. Morgan had seen plenty of criminals break under pressure. Bowman didn't. He just smiled and kept quiet. Chief Hendrick watched from behind the two-way glass. Arms crossed, jaw tight. "You sure he's the one?" Morgan didn't take his eyes off the mirror. "He owns the land. Signed the property transfers. Was the last known contact for 3 of the missing men. We found 6 survivors connected to him. Still, no confession. Not a single word." Ranger lay beside the observation window, alert but calm, eyes locked on Beaumont, just watching. The same way Morgan and the rest of the town were watching now, cold. Water was unraveling. The moment Bowman's mugshot hit the news, neighbors began recalling strange late-night construction sounds. Abandoned lots suddenly seemed suspicious. Calls poured in about missing family members, odd donations, whispered church gatherings, and a growing sense of dread. Because Bowman hadn't just harmed individuals, he had convinced an entire town to ignore what was right in front of them. As dusk settled, Morgan stepped out of the precinct, weighed down by fatigue. The wind bit through his uniform. The sky had turned a dull gray. Reporters were already gathering behind the yellow tape, microphones raised, questions flying. "Officer Morgan, did the canine unit recover all the victims? Was this a cult?" Is the church funding connected to money laundering? He said. Nothing. Ranger stayed close, calm and steady. They got into the cruiser, but Morgan didn't start the engine. He stared out at the fading horizon. The town cloaked in uneasy quiet. Feels like we've only scratched the surface, he muttered. Ranger wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Morgan sat in his living room. A half-drunk beer sat untouched on the table. Maps and documents were spread across the floor. Ranger rested nearby, snoring softly. Lucas Trent had fallen silent again. Doctors called it trauma-induced withdrawal. Franklin Ellis declined all media interviews. The rescued men had been transferred to an out-of-state trauma center. Everyone wanted to move on. Morgan couldn't. He picked up the envelope that had arrived without a sender. Inside were 3 things: a photo, a set of GPS coordinates, and a handwritten note in a shaky scrawl. The 7th didn't make it. The location pointed to an abandoned storm shelter north of town, on an overgrown farm, long forgotten. It wasn't listed on any recent property records. Satellite imagery showed nothing but weeds and rusted fencing. Morgan didn't wait. At 4:30 a.m., he loaded Ranger into the cruiser. No sirens, no backup, just him, the dog, and a feeling that something awful lay ahead. The shelter was buried beneath 2 feet of overgrowth. Ranger located it first, barking sharply and pawing at the earth until the old concrete revealed itself. Morgan pulled open the rusted hatch. The hinges groaned in protest. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The smell hit instantly decayed, not fresh. Long settled, he moved carefully down the stairs, flashlight cutting through the thick gloom. At the bottom was a cramped space, a single cot, a bucket, a decomposed plastic bag of personal items, and a body, male, nothing but bones. It looked like he had sat down to wait and never stood again. Etched deeply into the wall, carved with what seemed to be a spoon, were the words, "I told the truth. That was my mistake." Morgan stood motionless. No tears, no anger, just silence. He thought about all the people who had tried to speak out: journalists, whistleblowers, everyday citizens who had paid for it with their lives. He glanced back. Ranger was waiting patiently at the top of the stairs, watchful and still. A steadfast companion who wouldn't leave until every buried secret had been unearthed. Back at the station, Morgan input the GPS data into the cold case system. The remains were identified as Ron Whitaker, an environmental scientist who had disappeared in 2012 after publicly accusing the county of manipulating groundwater. Safety records tied to a development firm that funded Bowman's campaign. The 7th victim. Confirmed. Morgan added the name to the list, pinning it to the board. Another life, another story, another person the system had forgotten. But not anymore. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered. A low, gravelly voice came through the line. "You've done enough, officer. Let it go." Then silence. No name, no number. Just a warning. The next morning, Morgan submitted a formal request to hand the case over to the Department of Justice. He also filed for extended leave. When Chief Hendricks gave him a questioning look, Morgan simply said, "This case is too big for one badge." The chief didn't argue. That weekend, Morgan stood outside the Coldwater Canine Training Center. Ranger was at his side, tail wagging softly. The town had turned out in full families, school kids, retirees in lawn chairs, holding homemade signs. "Thank you, Ranger and Coldwater's real hero." Under a clear blue sky, Morgan stepped up to the microphone. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth doesn't just get hidden, it gets buried deep. Behind locked doors, under concrete, in silence. And sometimes, the only one willing to dig it up can't even speak." He reached down, gently scratching behind Ranger's ears. This dog didn't just track down criminals, he uncovered history, secrets, injustice. He scanned the crowd, his gaze narrowing slightly. "And if anyone thinks truth like that can stay buried, ... He paused. "You clearly don't know how good this dog's nose really is." The road leading out of Coldwater was long and quiet. Morning sun spilled across the wheat fields in golden streaks, casting shadows that stretched for miles. Morgan sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to pat Ranger gently behind the ears. The shepherd barely stirred, just a low grunt and a slow blink, his head resting on the console. Both were exhausted. But it was the kind of tired that comes after finishing something important. Morgan had turned over every file. The DOJ took full command of the investigation. Within 72 hours, accounts were frozen, arrest warrants issued, and search teams were knocking down doors from Missouri to Washington. D.C. What began in an old, forgotten well had reached the highest levels of power. Bowman hadn't acted alone. He was just the first lay above, a rotten web of developers, zoning officials, and corporate execs, all tied together by a silent agreement: eliminate those who asked too many questions. But not this time. Not with a dog who refused to walk away. Morgan turned onto a gravel road about 20 minutes north of town. The air smelled of cedar and wild clover. Birds sang above as he passed a vine-covered mailbox marked Whitaker Family Cemetery, private property. He parked under the shade of a broad elm and stepped out. Ranger followed closely, tail low, body calm. They walked among the weathered headstones, some cracked, some sinking, all clearly maintained with care. Near the back stood a newer marker. Ron Whitaker, 1973 to 2012, I told the truth. That was my mistake. The same words carved into the shelter wall. Morgan knelt, brushing leaves from the base of the stone. From his pocket, he pulled a small metal pin cold water, PDK-9, division, and placed it gently on the ground. No one's forgetting this time, he whispered. Ranger sat silently beside him, ears perked, eyes fixed on the gravestone, with that quiet awareness only dogs seemed to possess, like he knew what it meant, even if he couldn't say it. The drive back was quiet, no haju, no shatter. Just the rumble of tires on gravel and the steady rhythm of the road. Morgan didn't need noise. His mind was full. Faces, names, voices. Lucas Trent. Franklin Ellis. Ron Whitaker. Gary Phelps. The ones who survived, the ones who didn't. All silenced until now. 2 days later, the mayor's office held a public ceremony at City Hall. Hundreds showed up, not to honor politicians but to honor a dog. The department awarded Ranger the Medal of Civil Valor, the highest distinction they could give, whether to a human or canine officer. Morgan didn't speak that time. He stood quietly on stage, Ranger by his side, acknowledging the applause with a nod. One hand on the leash, the other holding a framed photo of the well in the woods. The place where everything had started. That well would soon become a memorial. A stone plaque, a bench, and a small garden planted by local children. At its center, a bronze statue of a German shepherd, head held high, ears forward, paw lifted. The inscription would read, "Ranger, he never walked away." That night, Morgan brought Ranger home for good. No more patrols, no more drills, just slow mornings, long walks, and naps in patches of sunlight. The department offered him a new partner. He declined. Ranger did enough for 10 lifetimes, he said. Instead, he built a fenced yard behind his cabin in the woods, installed a dog door, took a part-time role at a local veterans support program, helping soldiers transition back to civilian life, using service dogs. At night, he told Ranger stories. The same ones. Over and over. Each time, a little different. Each time, a little harder to finish without choking up. Months passed, and Coldwater began to mend slowly but surely. The church reopened with a new leadership team. Survivors received counseling and safe housing. A community fund was established in their honor. Children wrote letters. Local history classes started telling the story with a little more honesty. Every now and then, someone would recognize Morgan at the post office, or while pumping gas. "Hey, aren't you the one with that amazing dog?" He'd smile, shake their hand, and reply, "Nah, I'm just the one who kept up." One crisp autumn afternoon, Morgan and Ranger sat at the edge of a trail overlooking the hills. A soft breeze stirred the leaves as the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden light over the valley. Ranger rose, nose to the wind, then turned to Morgan with a look that felt like memory or maybe release. Morgan reached over, gently scratched behind his ears, and said softly, "We did good, buddy." Ranger leaned in, and for the first time in a long while, Morgan felt weightless. As if justice, real, honest justice, still had a heartbeat. One that echoed in quiet footsteps and padded paws, in out-of-the-way places where truth doesn't scream, it waits. This has been the story of a dog who refused to give up, and a man who chose to listen when it mattered most. And now, just consider this. What if the only truth you'll ever hear comes from someone who can't say a single word? Would you hear it? Or would you keep walking, like so many already have?